There is a specific kind of silence that happens, not when the room is empty, but when you are standing right in the middle of a crowded one. You are there. People are laughing, talking, reaching across tables, finishing each other's sentences, and you are watching all of it from somewhere slightly behind your own eyes. Not bored exactly, not sad exactly, just absent. Present in body, but somehow hovering just above the scene, observing it like a naturalist watching an ant colony, curious almost, but untouched. And the worst part is that you have been in this room before, many times. These might even be people you care about. But tonight, the connection you are supposed to feel, the warmth, the ease, the sense that you belong to something, is simply not there. And you go home and you sit with that, and you wonder what is wrong with you. You rehearse the evening in your head. You said the right things. You smiled at the right moments. You asked questions, laughed when you were supposed to laugh. From the outside, nobody would have known. But you knew, because the whole time there was a part of you that was watching the performance, noticing the mechanics, tracing the invisible choreography of social rituals, who leans in, who deflects, what words nobody actually means, what silences everyone pretends aren't awkward. And instead of simply being in the room, you were studying it. And instead of that making you feel wise or interesting, it made you feel terribly, profoundly alone. This is the thing that nobody tells you about a certain kind of mind. The books will tell you about genius. The internet will tell you about introversion. The wellness industry will tell you to go to therapy or meditate or practice gratitude. And none of that is wrong exactly. But none of it quite names what you are actually experiencing, which is not a disorder or a deficit or a personality flaw. It is something older and stranger than that. It is what happens when your mind begins to outpace the social world around it, not because you are better than that world, but because you have started to see it differently. And seeing differently, it turns out, is one of the loneliest things a person can do. Richard Feynman knew this, not in an abstract biographical sense, though his life was full of it, but in the daily, grinding, existential sense of a man who found most conversations genuinely difficult to sustain, not because he was cold or arrogant, but because his mind was always moving faster than the small talk, always pulling at the thread underneath the surface, always wanting to go deeper into whatever was actual, lie interesting instead of performing the social script that everyone around him seemed to have memorized. He was beloved, eventually, famously. He could be warm and funny and disarmingly human, but he was also, for long stretches of his life, a man who sat at parties feeling like a foreign correspondent in his own culture. And rather than diagnosing that as a problem, he spent his life trying to understand what it actually was. So if you have been sitting with this particular flavor of aloneness that doesn't quite feel like loneliness, this quiet that doesn't quite feel like emptiness, this sense of being slightly outside the circle of ordinary human warmth, then what follows is not a cure. It is not a list of hacks or affirmations or cognitive reframes. It is something closer to a recognition. Because before you can understand what you are going through, you have to stop misreading it. And most people who experience this misread it constantly, sometimes for years. The first thing you misread it as is depression, and this is understandable. The symptoms overlap in ways that are genuinely confusing. You withdraw. You lose interest in things that used to excite you. You feel flat in social situations. You find yourself saying no to things you used to say yes to, not because you are afraid, but because the energy required to perform enthusiasm you don't feel has become simply too expensive. You look at your own life from the outside and it appears fine, good even, and yet you feel none of the warmth that is supposed to accompany a good life. And you think, something must be broken. Something in the mechanism has come loose, because this is not how people are supposed to feel. The second thing you misread it as is arrogance. You notice that conversations that should engage you don't. You notice that people who should interest you leave you unstimulated. You notice that the topics that occupy most of the social world around you, the gossip, the status games, the endless commentary on things that will not matter in 5 years, seem almost impossibly thin to you, like paper scenery in a play. And you know that this observation makes you sound insufferable. You know that saying most conversations bore me is exactly the kind of thing a pretentious, self-important person says. So you start to wonder, am I that person? Am I just too proud to connect, too cold, too convinced of my own specialness to let people in? And the third thing, maybe the most insidious, is that you misread it as a character defect that needs fixing. You try harder, you make more effort, you practice small talk, you read articles about how to be a better conversationalist, you attend the parties, you show up, and it helps a little for a while. But eventually you come back to the same quiet place, the same slightly outside the room feeling, the same exhaustion afterward, the same sense that you have been performing rather than living. And the performance is good. People like you mostly, or at least they seem to, but it costs you something. And after a while you start to wonder if maybe the performance has gone on so long that you no longer know what was real underneath it. None of these are correct readings. Not the depression reading, not the arrogance reading, not the character defect reading. They all make the same fundamental error, which is that they treat your experience as a deviation from a norm that is itself never questioned. They assume that what most people feel in social situations is the baseline, the healthy version, the correct way to be human, and that your experience is a failure to reach that baseline. But this assumption deserves examination, because there is another possibility entirely, the possibility that what you are experiencing is not a failure of connection, but a shift in perception, not a broken instrument, but an instrument tuned to a different frequency. Feynman used to talk about the difference between knowing the name of something and knowing something. He would describe a bird, say it was a brown-throated thrush in America, a Halzenvogel in Germany, a buso in Japan, and point out that knowing all those names gives you no information about the bird itself, the bird's relationship to other birds, its evolutionary adaptations, the aerodynamics of its wing structure, the biochemistry of its song. All of that is invisible in the name. And yet most of human social life, he noticed, operates almost entirely at the level of the name. People exchange labels, they discuss surfaces, they navigate the agreed-upon shared fiction of polite interaction without ever asking what is actually underneath it. And Feynman found this maddening, not because he was superior, but because he was genuinely, almost biologically incapable of finding surfaces satisfying. He needed to touch the actual thing, and in a world where most social currency is traded in pleasant surfaces, that need makes you feel almost inevitably like an outsider. The first trait that marks you as different, in the way Feynman was different, is not intelligence in the way the word is usually used. It is not that you score high on tests or read more books or understand complex material faster, though those things may be true. It is something more specific and more fundamental. It is that your curiosity is non-negotiable. Most people have interests. You have obsessions. Most people can choose to engage with a topic or set it aside. You cannot. When something catches your attention, a question, a pattern, a contradiction, an unexplained edge in the world, you are not free to leave it alone. It follows you. It sits with you at dinner and in the shower and in the middle of conversations about other things. And it is not unpleasant exactly. The obsession often feels like the most alive you are, but it is socially costly, because obsessions are hard to share with people who don't share them. And trying to explain why something fascinates you, when the person you're explaining to is waiting politely but not actually curious, is one of the loneliest experiences a mind like yours can have. The second trait is a tolerance for solitude that other people experience as something close to a warning sign. You do not merely accept being alone, you require it, not as a symptom of isolation or fear, but as a metabolic necessity. Your mind processes the world continuously and at high volume, and other people's presence, their noise, their needs, their conversational rhythms, adds to that volume in a way that can become genuinely overwhelming. Solitude is not where you go when you give up on connection. It is where you go to become coherent again. And this need is often misread, both by you and by others. Others read it as coldness or disinterest. You sometimes read it as further evidence that something is wrong with you. But the truth is simpler and less dramatic. Some minds need quiet the way some lungs need thinner air. It is not a flaw, it is a requirement. The third trait is analogy, and this is the only word that fits, to intellectual dishonesty. You cannot participate, even politely, in conversations you know to be false. You cannot nod along to confident assertions made without evidence. You cannot perform agreement when you feel none. And this, more than almost anything else, creates friction. Because most social interaction depends on a certain degree of performative agreement. The lubricant of social life is largely made of statements that nobody checks and positions that nobody really defends. And you cannot provide that lubricant. Not because you are trying to be difficult, not because you enjoy conflict, but because something in you is constitutionally incapable of pretending to believe things you don't believe, and the effort it takes to simulate that pretense leaves you feeling hollowed out afterward. Feynman described this as the necessity of not fooling yourself, and the hardest part, he said, was that you are the easiest person to fool. You have to guard against your own wish to be accepted as fiercely as you guard against the errors of others. The fourth trait is that your relationship with certainty is fundamentally different from most people's. You are comfortable. More than comfortable, you are strangely at home, in the space of not knowing. Most people find uncertainty destabilizing. They resolve it quickly, often prematurely, collapsing ambiguity into a position before they have enough information to justify one. You do not do this. You can hold a question open for years. You can sit with contradictory possibilities without needing to choose between them. You can say, "I don't know," and mean it not as defeat, but as a kind of honest housekeeping. And this, again, is socially expensive, because people want to know where you stand. They want positions, they want the clean lines of a worldview they can agree or disagree with. And when you offer them a careful, qualified, provisional account of something complex, they often experience that not as honesty, but as evasion. They think you are avoiding commitment. But you are doing the opposite. You are taking the question seriously enough to refuse the comfort of a false answer. The fifth trait is the most difficult to articulate, and in some ways the most important. It is a quality of perception that Feynman had, and that you likely recognize in yourself. The capacity to look directly at a thing, without the mediation of what you have been told the thing is. Not naivety. You know what you have been told, and you know how to work within those frameworks when necessary. But underneath the frameworks, there is a part of you that is always asking, but what is it actually? Not the category, not the consensus, not the agreed-upon social meaning, but the actual thing stripped of all the human overlay. This is why certain very simple phenomena can hold your attention for an extraordinarily long time, while elaborate social performances leave you cold in minutes. The way light changes on water, the specific texture of a problem when you first encounter it, before you have been given someone else's solution, the strange feeling of a word when you say it too many times and it loses its meaning entirely. These things are not trivial to you, and the people who find them trivial, who look at you looking at the light on the water and ask if you are okay, are not wrong to be puzzled. But they are operating in a different perceptual register entirely. Now here is where it becomes important to pause and to be honest about something that can go wrong. Everything described so far, the non-negotiable curiosity, the need for solitude, the allergy to dishonesty, the comfort with uncertainty, the capacity for direct perception, can be, and often is, co-opted by the ego into a different story entirely. And that story is, I am more awake than other people. I see things they don't. I feel less because I understand more. My discomfort in social situations is evidence of my depth, and their ease is evidence of their shallowness. And that story, while it has the same furniture as genuine self-understanding, is something entirely different. It is the mind protecting itself from the vulnerability of real connection by dressing up its defenses as insight. Feynman was not immune to this. No mind is. There are accounts of him being unkind in academic settings, dismissive of work he found uninteresting, impatient with people he deemed intellectually slow. His capacity for honesty, which was genuine and admirable, shaded at times into a brutality that was not about truth-telling at all, but about the quiet pleasure of being the one who knows. This is a trap that exists specifically for minds like his, and like yours, because the transition from genuine lucidity to intellectual pride is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It happens gradually, in the small moments of daily life, in the private satisfaction of having seen through something that everyone else believes, in the subtle contempt that can grow in the space where compassion used to be. So notice this. If your sense of being different has started to feel like a verdict, not just about you but about the people around you, something has shifted. If your solitude has started to feel not like a requirement, but like evidence of your superiority, something has shifted. If your low tolerance for social performance has started to express itself as actual disdain for the people performing it, rather than as simple fatigue with the performance itself, something has shifted. These are not signs that you have understood more. They are signs that the ego has gotten into the mechanism and is using your genuine traits to serve its own needs. And the only remedy for that is not more analysis, but more humility, the specific humility of remembering that you are also always capable of being wrong, of being blind, of being exactly as unconscious as anyone else in the ways that matter most. The loneliness you feel is real. This deserves to be said plainly, without qualification. It is not a misperception or a cognitive distortion. There genuinely are fewer people in the world who operate at the particular frequency you operate at, and finding those people is genuinely difficult, and the absence of them is genuinely felt as a kind of hunger that other forms of company cannot satisfy. You can be surrounded by people who like you and still be lonely, in the specific way a mind like yours gets lonely, which is the loneliness of having no one to be fully real with, no one who doesn't require you to modulate the signal, no one in whose presence you can follow a thought all the way to the end without losing them somewhere in the middle. And because that loneliness is real, there is an enormous temptation to fill it badly, to lower the frequency and find the company of people who don't challenge you, to raise the walls further and decide you simply don't need what you cannot find, to perform relationships rather than have them, to use intellectual activity as a substitute for intimacy. These are all real strategies that real people use, and they all work in the short term, in the way that most poor substitutes work. They reduce the acute pain of the hunger, but they do not nourish. What does nourish, and this is said not as a promise, but as an observation, is the quality of your attention to the world itself. The relationship between a mind like yours and reality, unmediated, is not a consolation prize for failed human connection. It is its own form of intimacy. Feynman described the moment of understanding something, of really seeing how a phenomenon worked, as one of the purest pleasures available to a human being, not a substitute for love or friendship or belonging, but a real thing, a real encounter, a real form of contact with something larger than yourself. And the people who share that, not just the content of it, but the quality of attention it requires, are the people you are actually looking for. They are not common, but they exist. And they are almost always like you, somewhere slightly outside the room, watching the light change on the water, pulling at the thread underneath the surface, unable to leave a real question alone. In the meantime, and the meantime may be long, there is something to be said for learning to inhabit your aloneness differently, not to enjoy it in a performative way, not to aestheticize it into a lifestyle, but to actually live inside it without constant resistance. The resistance itself is exhausting, the insistence that this must be a temporary condition that will resolve once you find the right person or the right community or the right circumstances. That insistence keeps you in a permanent state of waiting. And waiting is one of the least alive states available, whereas simply being here, in this, without knowing when it changes or whether it changes, that is at least honest. And honesty, even uncomfortable honesty, has a strange, nourishing quality that false comfort never provides. This is what Feynman understood that many people who admired him missed. They saw the brilliance and the bongos, and the irrepressible curiosity, and the beautiful explanations and the Nobel Prize. They saw the social performance, which was real and warm, and often genuinely funny. What they sometimes missed was that underneath all of it was a man who had made a kind of peace with not fitting, not because he had resolved the not fitting into something comfortable, but because he had decided that the not fitting was inseparable from everything he valued about being alive. The same mind that left him slightly outside every room was the mind that could see the world clearly enough to explain quantum electrodynamics. You cannot separate those things. You cannot take the depth and remove the distance that comes with it. They are the same feature. So when you sit in that room slightly behind your own eyes, watching the performance, feeling the specific cold of not belonging, what you are feeling is real. It is not imagined, and it is not your fault, and it is not going to be fixed by trying harder to perform warmth you don't feel. But it is also not the whole story, because the same perceptual capacity that makes social ease difficult is the capacity that makes real contact, when it comes, more complete than most people ever experience it. The same allergy to surface that leaves you bored at parties is the thing that makes you stop at a question no one else noticed was worth stopping at. The same need for solitude that separates you from casual company is the container in which the deepest thinking happens. You are not broken, you are not cold, you are not arrogant. though you will need to remain vigilant about that possibility for the rest of your life. You are not depressed, though you may sometimes also be depressed, and those two things can coexist without one explaining the other. You are a particular kind of mind, in a world that was not designed with that mind in mind, trying to find your way to the kind of aliveness that is actually available to you, which may look different from the aliveness available to people whose minds work otherwise, but is not less real and is not less worth pursuing. The happiness that is available to you is quieter than what the culture advertises. It is not the happiness of constant stimulation or social fluency or the warm glow of belonging to a crowd. It is something closer to what Feynman felt standing in front of a blackboard at 2 in the morning, the room empty, following an idea through all its implications without anyone waiting for him to finish. A happiness that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't peak and crash, that lives in the act of genuine attention rather than in the reward that comes after. It is the happiness of being exactly where you are, inside exactly the mind you have, without apology and without performance. That is not everything, but it is not nothing. And on the nights when you come home from the room you couldn't quite enter, when you sit in your own quiet and wonder what is wrong with you, it might be worth remembering that nothing is wrong with you. Something is happening to you, something long and slow and occasionally painful and almost certainly necessary. And Feynman, who spent his whole life being exactly that strange, and exactly that alone and exactly that alive, would probably tell you, in his characteristically blunt, slightly impatient, genuinely kind way, that you are asking the right questions, and that asking the right questions, even when they bring no comfort, is the only honest way to be in the world.